this piece, which is titled Istanbul, was the first of two really early pieces that I did. One is on the wall, we can capture it later. And then this one was the first time, though, that I overlapped some rivers in an oil painting. And in fact, one of the only times now that I think about it. But I was really just playing with lines. At that point, it didn't have anything to do with, politics or stories or the environment as much as these amazing lines in nature. What it did, I was intrigued with making them rounded and having them look like they could be, in this case, vessels, blood vessels or something. But there are three water systems represented here. Unfortunately, I only remember two of them for sure. One of them I somehow lost track of. The largest one is at Istanbul in the Near East. This is and that's north. North is is up on this one, and almost all of my paintings that's true. There, with a few exceptions. The pink with the sort of bright yellow around it is the delta for the Mississippi River turned upside down. So the channelized delta means that it has a very consistent width. And the third body of water, this one that overlaps here, I don't remember what that is. When it got framed, it covered up what I believe would have told me the answer to that on the back. And as I went back in my records, I so far haven't found the answer. But maybe it doesn't matter. That's the first one that I did, and I was playing with color. I was playing, you can see, with edges. And I really was learning a lot in the process of doing this in relation to how I wanted to treat edges where land meets water. This orange being the negative space for the other shapes, but also being, in the case of this edge, the land next to the waters at Istanbul. Those edges were influenced by Georgia O'Keeffe edges. I went to the Kemper Museum here in Kansas City, and knowing that they had one on display, one of her works, and I specifically went with that thought in mind, where I'm wanting it to have shape even while it doesn't. I want the edge to the contour to look like there is a curve. There is a naturalness to the edge. It's not anything artificial or flat.
So my painting kind of happens when I'm alone. Usually, the inspiration hits. It's my exploration of spaces that I physically enter and react and interact with during my everyday experiences. It's also kind of just spaces through technology and through my phone and just the massive amount of information that is kind of overwhelming to all of us. So they depict sort of openness. There's really no figures depicted or anything, and it's kind of just gets at a sensibility of what's familiar and then what's sort of unfamiliar and maybe anxiety inducing. I like to channel kind of the feeling of the contemporary experience of what's happening, whether it's a political, natural, sort of the colors kind of mimic wildfires and the things that are going on right now. So I think I'd want the viewer to see within the work a sense of what is happening now and a sense of familiarity of maybe what happened in the past and future. So I kind of just them to find themselves in it, but them to be sort of hesitant to enter these spaces.
Okay. My name is Robert Bupp. I am an artist. Been working in Wichita since 2002. I got my graduate degree from Georgia State University in Atlanta in 2002 and came out to Wichita and have been at WSU ever since then. And in my work, when I was a graduate student at Georgia State, one of the things that I was doing was walking to campus, going through these different neighborhoods, and it was a time of a lot of change. In Atlanta, there was an economic boom, so there were neighborhoods that were being completely leveled and these big condominiums built in these places instead of that. And there were other neighborhoods that were completely kind of left behind, and then there were historic neighborhoods as well that largely were untouched, but sometimes would also get torn down. And I was kind of intrigued with the pace of change and how, if you followed the money, you could see a kind of a political, what's the word? You kind of see the politics of it in some ways. And so because of the fact that I was walking 1.5 miles to school every day, I saw these things happening at a pace that was different than the way most people experience Atlanta, because it's a very car-driven city. The pace of change seems absurdly fast, and you actually don't see it all that closely because you're driving through the city in your car, commuting great distances. There's not much of a transportation system. There is, but it's not great. And the walking part of this became something that I was interested in including in the work, because I felt like I was seeing things at a molecular level. So ever since then, in my work, I've tried to include a sort of direct observation process that is related to actually being in place. I did do a project in Los Angeles a couple of years ago where I mostly had to drive through different places because I was exploring an area that was so completely spread out. But most of the time, I actually walk, and I kind of look for certain things, and I rely very much on the relationships that happen in the walking.
I appreciate, again, the colors that I was playing with at that time. Some lines to play with. And in the process of doing it, I really enjoyed, again, just thinking about sort of going back and forth as we do with what's literally there and what would be happening in nature as the water is affecting the land. It does happen that in this region, and I did look it up later after I chose to do it, this is not an area where there's as much rising water as in other regions fairly close by. I think because of the current, or there had something to do with currents around it. But nevertheless, by degrees, which is the title, it is rising. By degrees, there are things that will be affecting this area as in all regions. And I left what was the working grid open to emphasize that degrees phrase, so that there are the original lines on the canvas, on raw canvas, left alone. This is the place, this is the reminder that we're talking about degrees of temperature, as the hot color implies also. We're also talking about degrees as latitude and longitude. This is just a tiny bit below the equator. By about the width of this painting, when you go up another similar distance, you are at the equator. So that's, yeah, and the positive and the negative, like I took some photos, and I'm going to show you in a moment this that I enjoy doing so much, where I take a painting such as this and take photos of just certain parts of it, isolate the parts, and let those represent their own entity without seeing the full picture. Not only taking pictures of that straight on, but also at angles, as if instead of the satellite view, you're looking at it as if you're in an airplane or high on a hill. And that I've done.
So the piece Flag 2020 is supposed to be a representation of what the American flag means like right now. The piece, it's a little beat up looking and worn, and it's like created not purposely, haphazardly, but like it's okay, kind of what happened within the process. Underneath, it's done on tape, so it's somewhat non-archival, and the tape can be peeled off and it unveils the Confederate flag. More specifically, it was a Virginia Army battle flag, but it then got adopted by like white supremacists. And it, I mean, obviously represents white supremacy and racism and supremacy over other groups that aren't white. And you see it all the time, even here in Kansas. So it just seemed to me that the American flag still represents those sort of like heinous ideas of the Confederate flag. So rather than just like saluting it or being blindly patriotic towards it, I kind of wanted to show that it still represents these things underneath the surface. And so it's kind of like a literal representation of that.
So the practice of walking for me is part of the artwork because of the observations and the data that I'm looking for that I gain that turn into map pieces and videos, but also because I make these connections with people that I think are really valuable and sustaining. And for this particular show, I don't think there's going to be any representations of people that I've met. I always have to be really careful about that because I don't want people that I talk to feel like they're being represented unfairly. Or in some cases they don't want to be represented at all. And I also am really trying to be very careful about making sure that I'm putting the focus on my movements and not leaving it only to me being an objectifying presence where people that I'm talking to are just sort of in this traditional place of the subject for the artist. This is very much about my movements and my relationships. So the work that'll be in the show, because I could not actually go anywhere during the COVID period, quarantine period, while still going on, I kind of hit on this idea of doing these works that would be these map pieces that I've been doing. And in the past, what I would do is I would map specific situations that would be stories or information that were below the radar, things that weren't really easily known. And what I would do in one of these, for example, this one, this is from Los Angeles, is make a map of the place, but then I would use tar and rust. This is metal. So I'd make a map of the place itself, and I would document where I ran into certain considerations. And in this case, I was looking for public space disruptions, which would be anything from somebody skateboarding in a place where it was not allowed, to a protest that would happen, to an impromptu street party, a street vendor, any number of different things that I would come upon that were, I think that the public space eruptions that we have in a society where public space is still valued, and in some ways that public space is largely challenged in the US, and we see this in the way that we have been battling over public space over the last couple of months, where activists for BLM believe it should be used one way, and then there are people that come to defend it because it's private property, and where is that line between public and private? So this is a really important consideration that I've been working on through my own explorations, starting with my walking practice, but also documenting what is going on, and then mapping it in a somewhat abstract way, so as not to be in a position of shedding light onto people who are doing things that may be slightly extra legal when that's the case. I don't want to be that person who's making art out of something that shouldn't be happening, but I also want to make sure that I am making art about things that call attention to the fact that there's a dialogue happening in public space and it's a shared space.
these are some examples of some photos I've taken across two particular paintings, which I don't have in my own collection anymore. Other people do. But this is what happens when you take a photo across a surface that was on a canvas that had a particularly broad weave. And you're seeing the red, in this case this was land, not water, in the painting. But what's happening again is I'm looking across lines instead of directly on top of them. So this was from a painting that had a combination of the Potomac River, the Potomac and the Anacostia River. This will show a little bit of it, at Washington, D.C., as well as the Missouri and the Kansas River right here. And it was very specifically, if you looked at the painting from a distance, it looked like it could be a tree. The Potomac River comes up this way. This is south and north in actuality, geographically. But again, we're looking at a funny angle. This is the Potomac, this is the Anacostia. And then over here, overlaying that confluence is the confluence of the Missouri and the Kansas River. This is the Missouri, this is the Kansas. I did it in 2012, which is the anniversary year for the Clean Water Act. And I was thinking about, and I called it tribal waters, because every one of those waterways is named after a Native American tribe or nation. And I was thinking about the overlay of national and local politics. I mean, I wasn't initially, and then I came to realize there was a big story here that I was making without realizing it. And so I played to that. You know, it's like I'm going back and forth between the politics and the poetry. And it turns out that the person who bought this, all of a sudden he was telling me his story and about how he went to Standing Rock, and which is actually in another image I have, and how he's in politics. He ran for mayor here, and he's so interested in water. And I said, "You need this painting I've got." And I showed it to him, and he was interested in the story behind it because of the political angle. It just tied everything together. But these various pieces, I'm continuing to do that to a lot of the paintings, not all of them, to take photos across the surface. And here's a collection of them, actually, from a show called Side Trip, which was through Kiosk Gallery here in Kansas City. And they put together a little booklet, and these were the maps of what those rivers did, just in black and white, but a little key to the different rivers. But this shows, again, some of these same results of those photographs across the surface. So that it changes the perspective, it changes your viewpoint from satellite, and becomes more emotional to me. When you see it this way, it's like I remember flying into the airport and seeing, a river that looked like that. It changes the angles and the familiarity of it. And so the show was called Side Trip because of the fact that we were looking from the side, and I also was taking a break from another project, so it became Side Trip.
With my process, I like to show, once the piece is complete, like almost the first mark I made. So just like the spaces I'm depicting and like the experience I have, I think it's very liminal. With the paint, like inherently it's a real thing, but then like with painting you create illusions of things. So I like the fact that like my paintings are both those, and the paint itself is inherently both of those things. I like really thin paint and like to push space, and then like really flat, bold colors to like keep it flat, so it like kind of has that push and pull. I think it makes it interesting for the viewer to experience. And I just like kind of like I was saying, when the paint is like really being honest about what it is, but it also can like represent something. I think that's what good abstraction does, and that's what I try to do. So we can do another like process.
So these map pieces are intentionally kind of junky. They've got tar and they've got rust, and there's also paint and pencil, but they are intended to look like something that might have been discovered in an archaeological dig. So they're kind of questioning the sense of what actually is being mapped. And in this case, it's a pretty recent history, but I've made it to look old because I want to promote the idea that this could be something that documents things that would be within a different kind of value set for what actually is mapped. And what I mean by that is that the history of mapping is fraught with power and control issues, and it certainly has been going on for millennia, but was also a big feature of colonialism, and has oftentimes been used as a way of creating legibility onto whether it was tax or nationalization or immigration or any number of different things. Mapping is an agent of an agent of the powerful. So what I'm trying to do in that sense is reclaim it in a way to document something different. And I'm also trying to suggest that these things are the untold stories in a sense. They're untold because they are dug up. They're like look like they've literally been found out of the earth. So in the work that I'm going to be doing in this show, this one is one of my favorite newer ones. And this is actually Garden City, Kansas. So I've made this. I used to do them in the square fashion, and I kind of got sick of that. I just got a little bored with it. And I gave myself a new challenge by doing these in this the irregular patterns of the map space itself. And the technical challenge of that is quite daunting, actually. And I've learned a lot about how to do it. But it involves a much different process with the way that you have to make a shaped base to mount the metal on, and then you have to cut the top piece out separately, and then you have the side piece has to go on separately, and you have to kind of cut it down in a certain way where it becomes really foldable so that you can get all the folds for all these different little spaces. You know, and then what happens after I do that is I'll put tape on here to line off the grid of the town, and I'll go over that with paint, and then I go over that with tar, and the tar acts as, when I pull the tape up, and the next step, the tar acts as a resist for acid that I will put on here to rust this, some combination of acid and water. And then that's what ends up happening right down here. So I've rusted this area for where the protest happened, a BLM protest happened in Garden City back in June. So this was information given to me by a person on social media, a friend on social media, where I sought testimonials to having participated in these protests. And the reason I sought that was because I couldn't go to them myself. So I thought during the quarantine period, what I'm going to do is create these testimonials where people volunteer that they were at this, and I'm going to make intentionally small maps, and they're going to be from small towns, and because they're going to be so random and such small towns that people haven't heard of, it will hopefully point out some things related to having to experience this from a distance, but also the fact that this was happening in so many different places. So I got about 15 different ones and was able to make 6 different ones for this particular show that will be included. This one's Garden City. There's also one from Italy, and there's one from Pennsylvania, and another one from New York, and there's another one from Georgia. So they are really literally all over the country.
But it was just yesterday that I took photos of this painting in the same way. I laid it on the table, you know, brought all the lights up that I could, and and took photos. This is called Propagating Rivers. There's a lot I don't know about this. I just, it came upon me. I'm not sure exactly at what point, but I was thinking about how everything I've been doing has all these curvy lines. And actually, I think it came about partly because I knew I was going to be in this show, and looking at some of the other artwork and thinking about, I don't know, some of the geometry that, is involved in some of what one of them was doing. And I thought, actually, there might be a way to, that was only one of my thoughts. I was also thinking about these multiple rivers and overlapping. And but anyway, it came to the point where it was like, okay, propagating rivers. Each of these is an actual river. Each of these is a river. Almost all of them you would recognize the name of these rivers. A segment of the river, or a cutting. Should we think of the river as a plant instead of a river? Instead of water is this, the stem from a plant that might be propagated by putting it in a pot. In this case, it's a, rectangular. And there's a slight sheen. If you may or may not be able to see it there, but this has a gold and a silver thing that makes me think about finances, costs, investment, what it takes to take care of something, to want to keep it alive. Somewhere in there is where this is. I realized as I was putting it together, I have an influence from two places, from two other artists. One of them being Dürer in his etchings. There's one that is called, what's it called? I don't know, but it's a lot of weeds. It's something that when I first saw it, it just seemed like, well, that's sort of junky looking. And it's like, no, that's really elegant. It's just lots of plants, which in an etching can be done with such fragility, and it's so amazing. It's fastidious and really gorgeous to go into the detail of it. And because sometimes it looks like it, when you're overlapping something like this, it's like, how do you keep it from just looking like junky? But then it was like, well, you design it, you plan it, and that I did. This part of it reminds me of work by Ian Davis, which I should look it up to have the right words to describe where he is, what he does, if you're not familiar with him. But he's very much in tune with corporations and water failure, and a lot of his pieces have big, gigantic spaces with myriad identical men in suits, all gathered together. Some number of things that just are sterile in their vision of the future, on purpose, clearly on purpose. And you can see hints of what he's getting at is this dystopian kind of thing that is also elegant in the way it's executed and designed. And it just reminded me of him, that that these pots weren't going to look like ceramic pots that were made from terracotta clay or something. It was going to be something that was that tended toward the more sort of, I don't know, maybe not stiff, but perhaps you see what I'm trying to say. I'm still thinking about this, and feedback as people see it will be welcome. But I have a key to the specific rivers that will be available, and enjoyed sort of tracking them down and choosing where I wanted to cut them, and knowing that when you're propagating something, in fact, if you were propagating a plant, you usually want to capture a leaf or a fork or a particularly vital part of that plant at the top. And so I chose to do that with a lot of them, and place them so that the more dramatic ones were in fact at the top, especially with that one being the focus then.
Some of my artist influences would be Annie Lappin, LA painter. I believe she went to UCLA, and just like explosive paint and very fast and like energetic spaces, very abstract. She also gets into a lot of putting tape down, peeling it off, different layering, and sometimes like the very first mark you make, you put tape down, that ends up being like the thing closest to the viewer within the illusionistic space. So I just like the like kind of back and forth and reversal of process that you'd normally maybe do a painting with when it's like gessoed and you just like build up paint. Dana Schutz is kind of like similar with I guess like fun, almost like childlike mark making, but it usually is talking about pretty dark subject matter. Kim Dorland is a Canadian painter, and again, like he kind of paints like scenes of his everyday experience and just kind of the influences of his home, similarly to me. Content-wise, I think like Alfredo Yar is a great contemporary artist. The power of his work is really just like influential on me, and it's like striking how he physically does things to like try to connect with the issue, kind of like the million slides on the light table of the boy's eyes that saw his parents murdered during the Rwandan genocides. So, I mean, a broad array of influences. Wilhelm Sasnal, German painter, painting like, or Polish, I think, painting the Polish countryside and like seeing just like everyday people and places from his like upbringing. And I kind of do a similar thing when I'm back working in my hometown, and like just like various experiences I have there of spaces and like architecture play a part. So, yeah.
And I also made a new video, and I've worked on making videos that usually are about my own experience in these places, where I'm really focusing on myself in relationship to whomever I'm relating to in this place. And that may be something where you really just see my feet walking and the sound of street vendors in the distance, as the question then becomes about my existence within that space. So instead of me turning my camera specifically onto other people, I'm trying to create something where my presence in that space is inescapable, which is also a sort of a critique of my ability to be a tourist. In this sense, that's what's happening. I am actually being a tourist. So what I'm doing here is critiquing the fact that I'm able to be a tourist at all by keeping myself within the center of this, but not completely at the expense of the fact that you hear, and in some ways very much get a feel for people who are also there with me. They may be chanting in protest, they may be trying to sell things. In one case in particular, a person flipped me off, and I made sure that I actually got that on camera. In the video that I've done this time, I couldn't travel. So what I did do was, the one protest that I made it to was in Kansas City, and I managed to capture a lot of video of the helicopters going overhead. And that kind of made me think a lot, because I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I didn't just want to put into this solely my own experience within a huge protest where all you see is helicopters, because there's so many people that were there. But then again, I couldn't go to anything else, and I wanted so much to be able to. And I had this epiphany when I was in my house at one point, and I saw the ceiling fan overhead, and I thought, that's like helicopter blades. That sort of reminds me of the transitional scenes in Apocalypse Now, where the opening scene where you have to cut this because I'm forgetting the name of the character